Other news, Parliament has confirmed today it's appointed an independent person to investigate complaints of sexual harassment, intimidation and gender-based violence between members of Parliament, economic freedom fighters and Parliamentary Protection Services officials. Advocate Elizabeth Baloyi-Mere will now probe the incident that saw parliamentary officials and EFF MPs fighting against each other when the EFF tried to prevent President Cyril Ramaphosa from speaking in Parliament this month. Lisa Vetten is a gender activist and analyst and academic. Lisa, good afternoon to you. Look, it was a terrible moment. I say moment, it was a terrible hour to see this violence on Parliament and on TV between men and women. Is it the right course to investigate it in this way?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's also not the first time we've seen Parliament degenerating into violence. Everyone is reminded, taken back in a very unpleasant way to the Zuma years, where exactly these kinds of scenes played out. So it's incredibly important to find ways to deal with this and especially to address its gender dimensions. Because I think under Zuma, it was predominantly men. Now we have a situation of female MPs, some female protection service, and male MPs and male protection services. So it's going to, I think, be very important to think through how one responds to these kinds of disruptions. Because it's very likely they're going to continue.
I mean, is there any right way that a male official, a male police officer or a male Parliamentary Protection Services officer can physically subdue a woman MP, which is really the sort of claim here? I mean, it went the other way too, as I understand it. But I mean, is there any right way to do that? Or should it just never happen that a man is ordered to physically subdue a woman?
That's a very complicated question. I mean, because then, you know, you're going back into ideas around how do we manage gender relations? What are we saying about violence? Do we go back to situations where you don't have men in any way, for instance, involved with managing or using force on women? And I mean, this is some of the arguments that one has seen in relation to women's prisons, that you shouldn't have men in women's prisons, which we currently do have in South Africa. I think you then move towards discussions around, does one only then have, and this is often the position that is taken, do you then only have women who are, you know, who must obviously be the only ones to conduct body searches, for instance, when you're dealing with women, and also then within questions of subduing or the use of force. Quite honestly, one does not, under any circumstances, want to see Parliament degenerate into this kind of violence. But if this is going to happen, then you do probably need to think of having female protection officers work with women in order to be trained to use force in ways that are appropriate, if force is even necessary.
It's so complicated, Lisa. I mean, I could imagine, you know, situations where, and I think we have seen this, where, you know, a female MP or whoever, it doesn't have to be in Parliament, could be in another situation, uses violence against a man. Now, the man should not respond. But it's very difficult, if you see what I mean. I mean, self-control is absolutely vital. That takes us to training. It takes us to a sensibility, perhaps, too.
Well, exactly. And I think it also takes us to those more complicated questions that you also see raised by women in combat. There, the argument has been women are equal. They can fight, engage in combat or conflict, or conflict is just in just the same way that men do. And in fact, one shouldn't use the fact that you are a woman to say you cannot engage in combat, for instance. So I think that's a similar situation that confronts us here. Are we saying that women are equals regardless of gender, that when they protest, as they're fully entitled to, when they disrupt, are they being treated as protesters or disruptors, or are they being treated as women? Which then means we are now treating them very differently and no longer thinking about them as equal who can engage in disruption, protest, and combat on equal terms. So it also raises very complicated questions around gender equality. When do we uphold it by recognizing women's difference, or when do we uphold it by trying to treat men and women in the same way? So yes, it raises extremely complicated questions.
At the same time, if I remember correctly, Parliament doesn't actually have a sexual harassment policy. I don't know if that's going to really affect this investigation necessarily. But it takes us to another question, whereas does a policy, whether it's around sexual harassment or around how to deal with a situation like we've seen in Parliament recently, does a policy actually result in women receiving greater protection or not?
Well, it certainly can do. And I mean, it does the important things you've already highlighted. It means it forces people to sit down and think about the situation rather than floundering when they're confronted by it and behaving in ways that are unhelpful and even destructive. So yes, a policy would be useful in order to force people to think about this. and to make the necessary plans so that we don't see what we saw. I mean, I think the other area that we always perhaps don't think about is the relationship between MPs and those who are employed by Parliament. So traditionally speaking, you'll have sexual harassment policies that govern relations between Parliament, the employer, and its employees. MPs, however, are not employees of Parliament. They're there in service of their party. So a sexual harassment policy will not govern situations where you have an MP harassing an employee of Parliament. Parliament cannot hold them to account. It's their party. So that's where you have a gap and a lacuna that's not addressed. And it's one that consistently gets overlooked and is not thought about, even though there have been quite clear instances of this happening.
Parliament's obviously not the only employer in the country. If someone's working for a company and they feel, or an institution, that it doesn't have a sexual harassment policy, should they push for one? Does it make a difference?
It can make a difference, but in some respects, where you have an employer-employee relationship, you are to some extent protected by the Code of Good Practice on the handling of sexual harassment matters contained in our labour relations legislation. The problem is where you have somebody who is not an employer or an employee, like an MP. People who sit in these very ambiguous and grey zones and nobody knows how to deal with them. So, for instance, another complex area that comes up is where you have a student who belongs in a university serving an internship in a hospital, completing their medical training there, where they are then harassed by, say, a Department of Health official. The student is not an employee. What do they then use in order to protect them? So we do have all these funny little grey areas of people who are not quite employers and not quite employees. And those are the people we haven't really thought about as to how we effectively protect them. And, you know, the brouhaha in Parliament is another example of people who are not employers and employees, but nonetheless are having to work together. So how do we think about those circumstances?
Lisa Vetten, thank you very much indeed. I really do appreciate it. As you can hear, an analyst and academic, perhaps an activist too, on these issues. I do appreciate it.